Well, let's take a look at this now. The 9 wasted years, I don't know if you recall that, but that marked the term of former President Jacob Zuma. In an article published in City Press, Dr. Jason Musyoka, CEO of the Frontline Group, argues that South Africa's trajectory to the second lost decade is clear. He joins me now to discuss this further. Dr. Musyoka, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report. I would say that the latest audit outcomes from the Auditor General do well to, prove or to bolster your argument around the second lost decade. Municipalities, so many failing to obtain clean audits, how things decline in being able to do the same. But talk to us about the point that you were trying to make in this argument.
Right. So a couple of years ago, in 2019, if you recall, when President Ramaphosa took over in the end of 2018, in Davos, he made this pronouncement that South Africa was emerging from a lost decade. And of course, that we expected a lot of reactions, and there was a public conversation around that. The intention, however, was to try and make sure that there is a corrective measure that the country would emerge from that decline that was so evident, self-evident between 2008 and 2018. I wrote an article at the time, also to City Press, and I wanted to base that argument on facts. And I said that if you look at HIV and AIDS, the Zuma administration had done really well in terms of social grants. There was also widespread coverage. But I also picked up a number of economic indicators, and I suggested that if you look at, on the whole, all the economic indicators, the main ones, they did clearly indicate that South Africa was a sinking ship during those Zuma administration. But make no mistake, I also did suggest that the decline of South Africa was not altogether just a Zuma consequence. There were some other various crises that the country was going through. I mean, we had the global economic crisis, which was not Zuma's fault. We had the drought, 2015 and 16, which was also not Zuma's fault. And then we had another one, 2018 to 2021. Then there was COVID-19. So if you look at all of these kinds of crises, the Zuma years were really concentrated, or this crisis concentrated during the Zuma years. And unfortunately, they contributed to what then I concluded clearly that it was not just a political rhetoric. If you look at the academic definition of lost decade and examples from Japan and the US, clearly South Africa had lost a development decade. But my key argument for the current article on Tokozo is that the intention to correct that decline, I wanted to really examine and look at the facts, economic facts, and look at whether there has been any change of track. And my conclusion on this article is that there hasn't been. As a matter of fact, if you look at the economic indicators in 2018 and compare them with 2023, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the ease of doing business, you realize that South Africa has declined further, even on global ranking. And therefore, I conclude that because we are halfway into the second decade since 2008, we can clearly conclude that South Africa is way into the loss of the second development decade. Yeah.
Well, how do we make sense of the second lost decade? There is, of course, the growing disillusionment around President Cyril Ramaphosa and his new dawn. I think that has essentially been quashed at this point as South Africans contend with a power crisis that is literally, killing people who are reliant on that energy supply. How do we make sense of the second lost decade, or at least where did it go wrong, if indeed at the beginning there was such optimism and high energies around correcting the previous wasted years?
So one critical factor here is the crisis of governance. If you look at the crisis that I've just indicated, and in my article I do argue that we can talk of this crisis with a small c, if you're talking of COVID-19, because these are not recurrent issues. Global economic crisis happens once in a century and so on. So this crisis with a small c have been in and out, and the country has plunged into this, including the droughts. But when you look at the one constant, when you look at the governance question, that is a constant crisis. So going all the way back to 2008, we've not had just episodes of governance crisis, but Major, you spoke earlier about the failure of local government, and I want to touch on that, the fact that the functions, the basic functions, if you go back to political science history from, John Locke and the theorists of political science, there are key basic functions of a state. The state exists for some very basic functions. Before we even start to talk about developmental local government or developmental state, as we do here in South Africa. And one of those is provision of basic services: water, electricity, and roads. Those are basics. Any state that exists for those reasons. And the fourth one is military or security. If you look at those four metrics in South Africa now, you clearly can conclude that the state has failed in terms of security. South Africa is the security in the country. We practically live in a country that is compared to war zones as far as security is concerned. If you look at electricity, which is a basic service, we don't have enough even for industries and consumption, water and roads. So ultimately it begs the question, what then is the role of the South African state if it has failed the very basics? And I think it's on that level that you can clearly see, because it's a continuum of a governance crisis. Unfortunately, when the current administration came in, the intention and the expectation from the citizenry, voters and the public was that the language that was being used was renewal and reform, both of the party and of the state. And that was expected. But unfortunately, I think the diagnosis was very shallow. I don't think they recognized just how deep this governance crisis was. And now what we are seeing is a continuation of the governance crisis that started around 2008. And the problem with this is, that it leads us to a crisis of a capital C, a major crisis. And that we are not there yet. The discontent in public has not risen to a point where there are alternatives and grassroots movements, but you can clearly see the signs and the offshoots of these alternatives emerging, parallel states, as it were, beginning to form to fill in the vacuum of where the state is failing.
Right. Very concerning. Dr. Musyoka, you mentioned that we're halfway through the second decade, and that with the various inflection points that we've had a look at, the foregone conclusion is that it is a decade lost. However, we are fast coming upon a national election where there's a lot being said around smaller parties gaining, more confidence from voters, the ANC's own electoral decline being quite topical when we discuss these elections. Will that in any way prove another inflection point, this time at least to avert the capital C crisis that you've mentioned?
I don't foresee that. I think that if you look at the political theatrics in South Africa at the moment, usually what happens in most, again, make comparison with African states, you see alternatives that emerge, but they emerge slowly. They don't emerge as one major event. And the opposition party is not strong enough to govern the country. That much is sure. But you also see the emergence of conversations around coalition governments. And we've experimented here in South Africa some coalition governing. And what you've seen is, again, fragmentation with these parties that are supposed to pull together, holding on to their ideological positions. The problem with that is that they cannot dislodge the governing party. So 2024 is going to happen, but I don't foresee any major change. I think there is emerging discontent from the citizens themselves, but as far as the political theater is concerned, we still are going to see a continuation, which is why I make the conclusion that the next 5 years, which is still going to be ANC's administration, are going to plunge us back into even deeper crisis. But until we arrive at a point where the citizens themselves, the discontent becomes monumental, then you begin to see change. But I don't see any major change. This is really going to be moving the needle a little bit forward. It is going, of course, to be consequential, putting pressure on the governing party and reorganizing the opposition and the other small parties. But it's not going to have any major change on the current trajectory of the country.
All right. Well, Dr. Musyoka, thank you so much for coming onto our program and sharing your insights with us. That was Dr. Jason Musyoka, CEO of the Frontline Group.